Hello, everyone, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. Remember, we're on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, and this will also be available as a podcast. You'll find all the relevant links below via Linktree. So joining me today is historian, author, retired museum director, as well as a director of the Association of the Preservation of Civil War Sites, later become director of Pamphlet Historical Park and National Museum of Civil War Soldiers in Petersburg, Virginia. He also served on the National Oversights Board for the Institute of Museum and Library Services. He has had many appearances on C-SPAN, wrote a great number of books, one most recent called The Campaign of Giants, The Battle of Petersburg. He's recently appeared on a really good series of videos with American Battlefield Trust about the Battle of Petersburg. It's Wilson Greene. Welcome, Wilson.
Thank you very much.
Will, sorry.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I'm excited to have you. We're going to discuss the Battle of the Crater, which took place on July 30th, 1864. So set the scene for us a little bit, please, Will. For everyone, what's actually going on at this point during the Civil War, and how do we get to Petersburg?
Well, it's the summer of 1864. We're in the fourth year of the war, and the Union Army of the Potomac and the Union Army of the James, commanded as an army group by General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant, has established a relatively new strategy for the Union war effort upon his arrival in the Eastern Theater in the spring of 1864. And that operational theory is to apply simultaneous pressure against Confederate armies across the map. He has an offensive planned for Mobile, Alabama. His protege, William T. Sherman, is involved in attacking the Confederate Army defending Atlanta and North Georgia. And in Virginia, Grant has assigned an army to the Shenandoah Valley, an army to the James River to move up against the Confederate capital at Richmond from the Hampton Roads area in Southeast Virginia. But his primary emphasis is going to be with the Army of the Potomac under George Meade to move against the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's primary army, commanded, of course, by Robert E. Lee. And as a pursuit of this strategy, Grant and Meade conduct a series of engagements beginning in early May of 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness, and then continuing south and southeast at Spotsylvania, at the North Anna River, and finally at Cold Harbor, which you see there on your map, about 10 miles northeast of Richmond. All of these engagements are very bloody ones. The Federal Army is unsuccessful in either destroying Lee's army or creating some kind of a breakthrough in order to reach Richmond. However, the effort is successful in reducing Lee's army to really a defensive weapon. Lee is strong on the defense, but he has suffered enough casualties where it's very hard for him to go on the offense. Well, Grant, in early June of 1864, after failing to defeat Lee at Cold Harbor, makes the bold move to disengage from Lee's army and cross the James River, which is a very wide tidal river, as much as 80 feet deep, more than 2,000 feet wide. So this is a bold move. And to make a long story short, Grant will leave on June the 12th, 1864. And by June the 14th, he has begun crossing the James River well to the east of Petersburg. And he has essentially beaten Lee to the punch. His target is Petersburg, 23 miles south of the Confederate capital at Richmond, the second largest city in Virginia, the seventh largest city in the entire Confederacy, and most important from a military standpoint, the railroad nexus that supplies the Confederate capital and the Confederate Army at Richmond. 5 railroads lead into Petersburg, including every railroad going to Richmond save for one. So in essence, Grant feels if he can capture Petersburg, he can all but cut off Lee from the outside world, force Lee either to attack him at disadvantage or retreat from the Confederate capital and face Grant out into the open. So the stakes are very high, and Grant conducts this crossing of the James flawlessly, but a subject for a different story would be how he sort of bungles the movement to Petersburg on June the 15th, which leads to a series of 4 days of fighting between the 15th and the 18th, in which the Confederate forces at Petersburg, commanded by Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, are able to give up ground but maintain their defensive position until Lee's army can arrive from Richmond on June the 18th. So Grant's so-called first offensive at Petersburg failed to capture the city. A second offensive between June 23rd and June 24th also failed to capture Petersburg. And now Grant had sort of decided he was going to avoid making frontal attacks and instead attempt to maneuver around Lee's army and cut off all of the transportation routes into Petersburg one by one. Darren, this kind of sets up the action that will lead to the Battle of the Crater that will occur on July 30th.
Thank you. That was really good. Yeah, so the build up to the 30th July, as you said, you've covered. So you've got Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants of the 48th Pennsylvania, part of Burnside's 11th Corps. He comes up with an idea of digging the mine. How does it get passed up the chain of command, and what do the high command think of his plan, i.e. Meade and Grant?
Well, first of all, Henry Pleasants is an acting brigade commander, as you say, in the 48th Pennsylvania. Burnside had the 9th Corps, incidentally, not the 11th Corps, Darren. And he was a mining engineer, a very skilled mining engineer. And as a result of the fighting on June the 18th in that first offensive, the Union 9th Corps had achieved gains to a point just below a Confederate fort known as Pegram's or Elliott's Salient. They were located down in a ravine drained by a little stream called Poor Creek and the tracks of the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad. So they were very close to the Confederate fort, but in defilade, in other words, out of sight, out of immediate sight of the Confederates. And one of Pleasant's men in the 48th Pennsylvania, also a miner, about 100 members of that regiment were coal miners, sort of offhandedly said, if we could run a shaft under that fort, we could blow it to hell. Well, word of this got to Pleasants, the experienced engineer, and he thought that idea had some legs. And so he ran it up the chain of command. He first went to his division commander, Robert Potter, who said it sounded like a good idea. He then went to Burnside, who also said it sounded like a good idea. And then Burnside passed the idea up to the Army commander, George Meade, who was second from the right there on your screen. Meade was skeptical of this idea, primarily because of his chief engineer, a man named James Duane, who did not get along with Burnside. Meade didn't get along with Burnside either. So Burnside had low credibility with Meade and his headquarters. So Meade said, all right, you can try to do it, but he would not really offer any material assistance to Burnside's corps. So this digging operation, Darren, was primarily an operation that was restricted to the 48th Pennsylvania alone. They had to fashion their own tools. They had to find their own lumber for shoring. They had to figure out a way to dispose of the excavated earth without the Confederates seeing it. They also had to devise a way to ventilate the mine shaft, because the mine shaft would run about 510 feet, which was, according to Major Duane, the chief engineer of the Army, way too long for any ventilation to occur. Of course, they had to keep this secret from the Confederates. But as the diagram would indicate, what Pleasants came up with was a very logical and relatively simple principle that hot air rises. The photograph on the screen is the reconstructed entrance to the mine. And what Pleasance did was he put an airtight canvas door across that entrance. He ran a wooden duct or tube from outside of the tunnel into the shaft itself. And just at the top of the picture, and I'm using my cursor right up here, just below the crest of the hill, where the Confederates would be able to see you if you went any farther, Pleasance dug a 20-foot deep shaft, or basically a chimney. And at the bottom of that chimney, he put a grate, and he had a fire built there. And so on the principle of hot air rises, the fire would draw the bad air out of the shaft and up through the chimney, and then fresh air would be circulated and drawn through that wooden duct and into the tunnel to keep a relatively primitive air circulation system going. Now, we have a safety organization in the government here in the United States called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, which has to approve all industrial plans. And OSHA would not have approved this, I can tell you that, Darren, but never read any evidence from any of the men in the 48th Pennsylvania involved in this digging who said that they were suffering from a lack of oxygen, there weren't any casualties, nobody passed out. So apparently this system worked sufficiently to maintain life and to keep the construction going.
Yes, and can I apologise about the 11th Corps? It is the 9th Corps. I do. Sorry, I don't know why I wrote that down, but it ended up there. Right, sorry about that. Yeah, so I understand that Pleasance, when working out the construction of the mine, him and some of his staff strayed too far into no man's land. And this was a story that you mentioned on the American Battlefield Trust video. So please tell us a little bit more about that, because it's quite interesting.
Well, of course, one of the most important tasks that Pleasance had was making sure that the tunnel was aligned exactly properly so that the mine would be immediately below the Confederate fort. Now, that would be a relatively easy task to do if you could just stand up and use what was called a theodolite, which is basically an instrument that would allow you to triangulate distances and directions. Miners use this all the time. But of course, the problem was that Pleasance couldn't stand up in front of and see the fort and say, fellows, just hold on a second. I'm going to take a triangulation here. Don't shoot me. In fact, when he and a staff officer, the episode you're referring to, when he and a staff officer initially went to the edge of the high ground here to take a look at the fort and try to get an idea of where it was and how to align it, a Confederate sharpshooter put a bullet right through the head of his staff officer and killing him. So what Pleasance had to do from this point on is he had to take his readings with a theodolite, but he had to do it so the Confederates couldn't know that he was trying to do it. So he came up with this idea of having 3 or 4 of his staff come about 20 feet to his right and put their hats or their kepis on their swords and wave them above the top of the hill to draw Confederate sharpshooter fire. And while this was going on, Pleasance, who had fashioned a hood for himself, a burlap sack with eyelids, and he put dirt on top of the burlap sack to sort of camouflage himself, he would go and pop up, take his reading with his burlap sack on, while the sharpshooters were firing at his staff's hats 20 feet to his right, and then drop down and take another reading. And it worked, because when he completed the mine shaft on July the 23rd, he started on the 25th of June. He finished it about 4 weeks later. The shaft lined up perfectly with the Confederate fort.
Wow. I mean, did anyone have any holes in their hats?
Yeah, apparently they did.
Yeah.
The article of faith at Petersburg that if you popped your head up above the works, you were going to get.
You didn't do it, basically. So they must have heard this digging underneath them, the Confederates. So did this get fed back to the command? like
Well,
Lee and stuff?
yes, yeah, Darren, it did. I mean, a combination of talkative Union pickets. I mean, one of the things that Pleasants tried to do was to keep it secret, but it wasn't secret. Lots of Union soldiers knew what was going on. And rumors went back and forth between pickets that we're digging a shaft under one of your forts. And some of the Confederate officers were figuring that, you know, if they weren't coming at us over the ground, they might be coming under the ground. So it wasn't a sure thing, but there was enough suspicion on the part of the Confederates that they dedicated a number of engineer soldiers to dig what they called countermines, dropping vertical shafts into the ground to try to intercept a mine if one was being built. They also devised all these sorts of listening gizmos that they hoped would uncover the sounds of the digging. Well, the Federals could certainly hear the Confederate effort above them and had to maintain absolute silence. But the Confederate countermines never penetrated quite deeply enough in the ground to intercept any of the Union digging. And after a number of days in which they came up with no results, the Confederates began to dismiss this as a silly rumor. After all, the conventional wisdom was the distance between the Union lines and the Confederate fort was too great for this to be pulled off. So right before the actual explosion of the mine, most of the Confederates believed that there wasn't any danger.
No. And also I understand, obviously, from you know, getting their information, that they actually, one guy actually decided, let's dig another defensive trench back from the main line, just in case something would happen. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that would be called a Cavalier Trench. And this, when you visit Petersburg today, really people have no concept. There's no way to understand the maze, the labyrinth of earthworks that both armies constructed. We shouldn't think of one line of trenches behind which soldiers were placed. There were multiple lines. There were traverses, there were zigzags, there were these Cavalier trenches behind. The soldiers dug little sleeping platforms underneath the ground behind the works. So yes, the Confederates were constantly improving and trying to prepare for any eventuality in case they were attacked. Not so much because they were afraid of being blown up.
No.
They were afraid of being assaulted, and they wanted to create as many layers of defense as possible.
And this is what's quite interesting about Petersburg, because this is where the idea for World War I comes from. Is that correct? In a way, slightly. I mean, the trenches are the same, aren't they, in a way?
Well, in a way they are, yes. I mean, that analogy has been made many times, Darren, and I think to a certain degree, you know, it's true. Although I have to say that Petersburg was never really a true siege. Now, people call it the siege. The officers, many of the officers at the time referred to the operation as the Siege of Petersburg. And I'm not on the warpath to eliminate that terminology. You know, but to me, a siege implies a couple of things. One, that an enemy target is completely enveloped by works of the attacking force, and that never was the case at Petersburg, of course. And secondly, siege operations had a specific meaning in the 19th century and the 20th century, and it implied a series of approaches or zigzag trenches that with parallels that were constructed at various intervals so that artillery could be moved closer and closer to degrade and eventually destroy the enemy fortifications. That never happened at Petersburg either. So there were some aspects of World War I static warfare at Petersburg, certainly some analogies, but it was not entirely an apt analogy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the United States Colored Troops, because I understand that Burnside had trained the United States Colored Troops, hadn't he? And so they've been drilled. Once the explosion happened, this is what you're going to do. And of course, then George Meade doesn't like this idea, does he? So they pull the rug from under their feet. So explain a little bit about that for me, please.
Well, you're right that the Ninth Corps, Burnside's Corps, was composed of 4 divisions, 3 of them white troops, and 1 of them African American troops. And these black soldiers, some of them former slaves, many of them free men from the North who never were slaves, had never seen combat. They had just been enlisted in 1864. They were very eager to demonstrate their worth as soldiers and their worth as men. And to make things even more poignant, the 3 white divisions of Burnside's Corps had been badly bloodied in the offensives in June of 1864. So Burnside turned to the black troops primarily because the white troops were pretty much worn out by this time. And the black troops were eager to make these assaults. Now, you raise an interesting question about the training. If you've read most of the books about Petersburg and about the crater, you will read exactly what you said, that the black troops had extensive training for this very specialized operation. I did an awful lot of research on this, and I found some evidence of some limited training by the black troops, but there was lots of other evidence, eyewitnesses saying we never received any training at all.
Oh.
That this is a myth. So I'm frankly not sure how much training the black troops had. I think there was probably some, but I think it's been exaggerated over the years. I don't think they were all that trained. Mm-hmm. But you're exactly right that Burnside had them aligned. He had given them orders. Their officers, who were all whites, understood that their job, once the explosion occurred, was to go immediately towards the high ground at a place called Cemetery Hill. People familiar with Petersburg will know it as the Blandford Cemetery, Blandford Church area. That high ground dominated the Confederate line, and if Union infantry and artillery was there, Lee's defenses at Petersburg would be severely compromised. Well, back up just a little bit to put a little bit more context in this. Grant never really had a lot of confidence in this operation. Meade certainly didn't, and Grant didn't either. Grant sort of let this, Grant and Meade both let this construction go on. Better to have the men busy than have them idle. But Grant and Meade placed their main reliance on what would be called the Third Petersburg Offensive, not on anything to do with Burnside's mine, but with an operation on the north side of the James River. It would be known as the First Deep Bottom Operation. Mm-hmm. It's not the subject of tonight's discussion, so suffice it to say that that operation between July 26th and 28th was a tactical failure for the Federals. Mm-hmm. The only thing that it did accomplish was to draw a large percentage of Lee's army to the north side of the James. Mm-hmm. And as a result of this, Grant turned to the mine operation, which was ready to go, 8,000 pounds of black powder placed in hoppers in 2 lateral galleries underneath the Confederate fort by July the 28th. It was ready to go, and now Grant tells Meade, well, let's go ahead and try this. Maybe it'll work, and because most of Lee's troops are on the other side of the James River, we've got a chance here. So I think the point that I made in my book that not many other people have made was that this was an afterthought, not the main effort by Grant. Grant will sort of prevaricate about this after the war and say, oh, the deep bottom was a diversion. That was self-justified.
They've seen this opportunity that they're weaker in that part, so let's just go with it and see what happens.
Let's go with it.
Yeah.
So now, all of a sudden, this thing is a go. And Meade is taking a hard look at what's going to happen, and he sees that the black troops have been designated to lead the assault. He visits General Burnside late on the day on July 28th and says, General Burnside, we're going to go with this operation, but you can't use the black troops. They're inexperienced. They've never been in combat. And plus, listen, if this thing doesn't go well, the whole country is going to accuse us of caring nothing about black soldiers. Mm-hmm. You can't afford that politically. So you'll have to pick another division to lead the attack. Well, Burnside protests mightily against this, and Meade relents to the extent of agreeing to consult Grant about this to see what Grant says. Well, Burnside doesn't hear anything on the 29th, and he's optimistic now that Grant has gone ahead and allowed him to execute the plans as he has designed them. But then about noon on July the 29th, Meade appears again at Burnside's headquarters and says that Grant agrees with me, you'll have to pick another division. Now, up until now, Burnside had done everything right about this operation. The construction was a complete success. The planning was in place, but now he made a bad mistake. Instead of selecting one of his two competent white division commanders, Potter or a man named Orlando Bolivar Wilcox, Burnside left, I love your visual. Burnside left the choice up to chance. And they drew straws. Apparently it was straws. I've heard there's a couple of different accounts, pieces of paper, straws. But they left it up to chance. And the man who drew the short straw was the fellow on your screen, James Ledlie, a 32-year-old civil engineer from Utica, New York, who had political connections with the Secretary of State, William Seward, had served in backwater assignments until the spring of 1864 when he received the command of a brigade, led it in a drunken disaster at the Battle of North Anna, was drunk again on June the 17th during the Ninth Corps' attacks. But for reasons that are hard to understand, he was not cashiered from the Army. He was not relieved. And now the worst division commander in the Union Army would be given the responsibility for making this attack with less than 12 hours to go, or 14 hours to go before the explosion would go. And to make matters even worse, Darren, he gave completely different orders than the orders that had been given before. Instead of going straight for Cemetery Hill, Ledlie told his two brigade commanders that they were to approach the explosion and then go on either side of the explosion. The next two divisions would widen the breach, and it wouldn't be until the black troops, the 4th Division in, would head for the high ground. So you had the least competent division commander giving contrary orders, and this was a recipe for disaster.
And this is a reoccurring thing in the Civil War, is some of these political generals, isn't it? You know, they get their job and they just were, I don't know what they were thinking. But again, we wasn't there, so we can't, sometimes you can't always criticize. Okay. So the morning of the attack of the 30th of July, 1864, talk us through what happens. And because it's quite they start quite early, don't they?
They certainly do. Well, this was going to be a big operation, Darren. Not only is the Ninth Corps going to lead the attack, but the Union 5th Corps is going to be on its left. Elements of the Army of the James are positioned to the right. 154 pieces of artillery are poised to fire in support of the attack. And so this is now going to be an all-out effort. And the attack is supposed to begin about 3:30 in the morning with the explosion. Now, because the Army had not supplied Colonel Pleasants with the proper type of fuse, which was mining fuse that came in long lengths that was waterproof, instead they were just sent standard Army fuse, which came in shorter lengths, not waterproof. And so Pleasants had created a series of redundant fuses that ran about 98 feet from the place where the powder was actually stored. He dug trenches in the tunnel, put the fuses in there, multiple fuses. He knew that, and he had to splice them all together because he didn't have anything close to 98 feet of continuous fuse. So at 3:15 in the morning on July 30th, well before dawn, he lights the fuses and everybody is poised waiting for this unprecedented explosion. Well, 15 minutes go by, 20 minutes go by, nothing happens. Meade is bombarding Burnside with messages. What's going on? Why hasn't the explosion occurred? Grant rides forward at one point and tells Meade, listen, if this thing doesn't explode, tell Burnside to attack anyway, which I think is a remarkably reckless instinct on Grant. But Pleasance figures out that probably what has happened is the fuses have burned out at a splice. And so he and a lieutenant named Jacob Doughty get a lot of courage. They go into this tunnel, and sure enough, they discover that the fuses have burned out. But they had, in their anxiety, they had forgotten to bring any matches. So they had to go back out, get matches, go back in, relight the fuses, scramble back out. And at 4:40 in the morning, the explosion occurred. And it was spectacular. It created a crater that was 126 feet long, 70 feet wide, 25 to 30 feet deep. It immediately killed 352 Confederates from the 18th and 22nd South Carolina regiments who were poised, waiting innocently at Pegram Salient. And so now everything was set to go, and the orders came for the Ninth Corps to make their assault.
So when the explosion went off, were the Confederates on standby in the front trenches? Or is that how they would have?
Yeah, there would have been a certain number of soldiers on duty at all times on the trenches. Others were in their bivouacs, in their camps, but their camps were very close to the works. Now, another thing that I have found in years of leading battlefield tours and going to battlefields is that oftentimes we tend to constrict the size of the action into what we see. Well, this was a brigade of South Carolinians, 5 South Carolina regiments, and they covered more than a quarter of a mile, a third of a mile of front. So the explosion, 126 feet, but it, of course, was such a blast that, something like 33% of that brigade was caught in the explosion and killed him. The rest of the men on either side of the explosion did the logical thing and scrambled out of there. I mean, this was, I hate to use a bad analogy like an atomic explosion, but for the people of the 19th century,
that was, yeah,
the scene was as unprecedented as the atomic explosion was for the World War II generation. So there was shock and awe. And for a brief but real period of time, the Federals had a 500-yard gap in which all the Confederate defenders had fled or had been killed that would lead directly to the high ground at Cemetery Hill. But what happened? What were Ledley's orders? To go right for Cemetery Hill? No, his orders were to go on either side of the crater and hold the position while other troops widened the breach. And as these Federal soldiers got up to the crater, first of all, they saw the horrible result of the explosion: half-bodied men, disemboweled people, horses killed, artillery pieces ruined, human suffering, people crying and yelling. Their human instinct motivated them to try to aid some of these Confederate soldiers. And plus they were just stunned. And to make matters worse, predictably, General Ledley, who was supposed to be the leader of this organization, decided that he was not feeling well and decided that he needed to have some medical treatment at an aid station behind the lines, and that medical treatment included some alcohol. And so there were really no overall Federal leaders. General Meade, wanting to exploit this advantage, kept telling Burnside, send in more troops. And so Potter's division came in, Wilcox's division came in. In the meantime, the Confederates had the opportunity to kind of regroup. They closed off the shoulders of the gap in the line. They didn't close the gap, but they began firing from the flanks, which tended to make the Federal soldiers look for cover. including going down, some of them going down into the crater itself. Now, I must tell your listeners and your viewers that don't think of 10,000 Union soldiers huddled in the crater. I mean,
No.
it wasn't that big. But there were scores and scores of men in the crater, and then hundreds, if not thousands, of men on either side of it, hunkered down, not going forward like they should have. And then eventually the black troops were ordered in. They actually proceeded farther than anybody else, not all that far, but they went farther than anybody else. But they too stopped in the face of this Confederate infantry fire coming from the flanks, and then mortar fire and cannon fire coming at the crater, which of course now, with all of these 4 divisions, some 10,000 Union soldiers, basically leaderless, a mob around this 500-yard gap. Now, Darren, the initiative would go over to the Confederates.
Yeah. So some of them do end up in the crater, don't they? Is that just to try and get away from what's going on, or?
Exactly. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're looking for shelter,
Yeah.
30-foot hole in the ground is a pretty good, pretty good place to go. So yeah, a lot of people went down into the hole.
And like you said, without the leaders, they've got no one to say, "Come on, boys, get up," or nobody knows what's going on.
Precisely.
So where's Robert E. Lee when the explosion happens? Does he must hear this explosion and must think, what the hell?
Well, Lee,
what an alarm clock.
Yes, exactly. Lee is over a number of miles away on the other side of the Appomattox River. So is General Beauregard, whose troops are the actual ones there, the portion of the line. But word quickly gets to both Beauregard and Lee of what's going on here. I mean, I'm sure they heard the explosion, they didn't know what it meant, but couriers quickly informed them of what had happened. And Lee sends orders directly to one of his division commanders, bypassing his corps commander, a man named William Mahone, who, and there's a little Billy there on the right. Billy Mahone was a small man. He was about 5 feet tall. He barely weighed 110 pounds. Once he was wounded slightly earlier in the war, and his wife was informed that her husband had had a flesh wound. And her response was, well, the wound must be serious because William has no flesh. He was quite a character, but by the summer of 1864, Mahone and his division of 5 brigades had become the shock troops of the Army of Northern Virginia. Whenever there was a problem, send in Mahone. And that's what Lee did. He gave orders to Mahone to try to redeem the situation. So Mahone, who was there was only 3 divisions of Confederate troops in the Petersburg area at this point. Mahone was the farthest one away. And so he sort of dribbles his men 2 or 3 at a time back from the main line so that the Federals opposite him wouldn't be suspicious that something was going on. And he took 2 of his brigades, his old Virginia brigade and a Georgia brigade, about 2,000 men, and marched them on a circuitous route, a couple of miles, or they couldn't be seen. They emerge out of a ravine where Mahone implores them to make this assault. Now, one of the factors here that we cannot discount is that this is going to be the first time that these Confederate soldiers have ever faced black Union troops. I don't think I need to tell your audience the racial dynamics that were going in the 1860s in the United States, in the American South particularly. So the idea of black men blowing up their comrades and attempting to capture their city was so antithetical to everything that a Confederate soldier stood for that these fellows were extremely highly motivated. The other factor, and I think maybe one that's even more relevant, is that the black troops, as they went forward, began yelling, "Remember Fort Pillow, no quarter." Now, Fort Pillow was a battle that had taken place in April of 1864, in which a Confederate cavalry commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was accused of slaughtering surrendered black troops. And that, I mean, that's a different story. Whether that actually happened in that way is debatable. but it was widely publicized as a massacre of troops. So the black troops were saying, we want revenge for Fort Pillow, no quarter, which of course meant if we capture you, we're not taking you prisoner, we're going to kill you. The article of faith among the Confederates was just that. They believed that if they ever faced black troops, they would never be a prisoner. It was raise the black flag, no quarter. So this is the setup for this horrible battle that followed. Both sides believing that they had to kill and not capture. So Mahon's men, about 9 o'clock in the morning, they make this assault. About 1,600 of them are in position to make the attack. The bottom line is that assault is somewhat successful. It managed to recapture some of the ground north of the crater, north of the actual explosion, but not the crater itself. The Georgia Brigade attacks next. It doesn't succeed very well. And so by late in the morning of July 30th, sort of a quiet, a lull in the fighting descends on the battlefield. And Darren, it was 100 degrees. There was no water for these federal soldiers up there. And the human suffering that was involved, irrespective of people shooting at you, was unspeakable. Brave Union soldiers put canteens around their necks, as many as they could carry, and ran the gauntlet of fire back to their main lines, trying to get water and bring them to the front. It's important to remember that by this time, both Meade and Grant had given up on the effort. They had written it off as a failure. And basically, they were telling General Burnside, withdraw your troops as best you can, you're on your own. Burnside protested this. He wanted to hold the position that he had captured, but getting out of the crater was going to be pretty tough because a little difficult to explain without a good map or seeing the ground. But there would be, as you know, Darren, there would be a stretch of ground between the front at the crater and the main Union lines that were well within Confederate range. And the Confederates are lobbing mortar shells, they're firing cannons at these Federals. So any Union troop that tries to run back to the main line is going to be subject to terrible fire. So it's not a particularly good option. So the stalemate occurs. Mahone has realized pretty quickly that the two brigades that he had assigned to this responsibility were not enough to regain all the lost ground. So he summoned a third one of his brigades, the Alabama Brigade, under a young man named John C. Sanders, who had been a student at the University of Alabama when the war began and now was the brigade commander. And 632 of his men would traverse the same ground that the Virginians and Georgians had traversed, got into this sheltering ravine about 200 to 300 yards away from the crater, and laid there for an hour in this blistering heat until one of the more brilliant motivational speeches occurred, in which General Sanders pointed to a house that was only a few hundred yards away, called the Gee House, in which both General Lee and General Beauregard had taken shelter in to watch what was going on. That's sort of remarkable. They were that close to the action, two of the highest ranking generals in the entire Confederate Army that close to the action. But be it as it may, they were there. Sanders knew that, and he stood up in front of his men and said, gentlemen, you're going to get an order to make an attack. If you don't succeed in regaining the lost ground, General Lee is going to come out and lead you himself on a second effort. Are you going to let that happen? Well, of course, the psychology was, we're not going to put the revered Marse Robert in a position to risk his life because we couldn't get the job done. So that was a tremendous motivation for these Alabamans. And joined by 200 or 300 of the Virginians and North Carolinians and Georgians, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Sanders makes the attack.
Awesome.
Now, what happens then is probably, as I have said, some of the most brutal hand-to-hand combat that has ever stained the North American continent. As the Alabamans came up to the Federal troops who were left at the crater, it was hand-to-hand, muskets with the butt ends bashing in skulls, bayonets thrusting through bodies, people being shot at point blank range. The Federals had been suffering for hours up there. They were weak. They had a disadvantage. The Confederates, as I said, were highly motivated. And one of the things to bear in mind was that they were not going to take prisoners, particularly black prisoners. So what you had was literally a massacre of black troops. They would try to surrender. The Confederates would shoot them down. In fact, this didn't happen a lot, but it was documented on a few occasions. Some of the white Union soldiers shot their own black comrades in order to demonstrate solidarity with the Confederate attackers, which is, I say, wasn't widespread, but it happened. Another horrible example of what was going on. Finally, this slaughter was too much for General Mahone to stand, and he ordered it to cease. Quiet descended on the ground. The survivors of the Union attackers were taken prisoner. Some of the blacks were murdered on their way back to behind the lines. The Confederates were able to restore their lost ground, and they would hold that ground for the rest of the campaign until they evacuated Petersburg on the night of April 2nd, 1865.
And again, the casualties, like you said, I mean, the Confederates in the explosion lose nearly a whole regiment. Is that correct?
352 men.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have the statistics on there. And of course, statistics in the, casualty statistics in the Civil War are
guesstimates, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you see it officially reported, but I don't think anybody should take them literally.
No.
It's my opinion that the reported Union casualties are underreported. I don't have a number, but I think
no. I think that happens on quite a lot of the battles, doesn't it? Sometimes where they get a lot of them get under. Anyway, can I just ask about Burnside, because this poor guy, I mean, I have a little bit of sympathy for him because he is involved in two of the biggest blunders in the Civil War. Yeah, near enough. First one, obviously, Fredericksburg. I don't think Fredericksburg's his fault. I blame it more on Henry Halleck, to be honest with you, in a way. And again, with this one, but then again, I suppose this one, after listening to you and learning a bit more about it tonight myself, it is really his fault, isn't it, really? He should have, selected a better person to lead the attack.
That was his one major mistake. There's a wonderful biography, the most recent biography of Burnside, written now about 30 years ago by a man named William Marvel. It's a brilliant biography. I recommend it to all of your viewers. And I think Bill makes a pretty good case that Burnside has a worse reputation than he deserves in Civil War history. I agree with you about Fredericksburg. Again, he made mistakes, no question. I'm not arguing that Burnside was a brilliant commander, but he was not the bumbling fool that he is often portrayed as being in Civil War. And here at the crater, he would be the scapegoat. After the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried, there was a court of inquiry held. As I said, General Meade did not like Burnside. He stacked this court of inquiry with people who were loyal to Meade and not loyal to Burnside. And needless to say, guess who got all the blame? Yeah. Burnside was sent home, officially on leave for 20 days, but he would never be summoned again to serve, and he eventually would resign his commission and after the war be elected multiple times to the governor of his state of Rhode Island, incidentally. General Ledlie would also be sent home on sick leave and basically cashiered from the Army. So he suffered as well. But this was a tragedy on lots of different levels.
Yeah,
And I don't think Burnside is totally responsible for it.
definitely not. Okay, well that's the Battle of the Crater. I really appreciate you giving us that, because it's just a great story. But again, like I said, it's harrowing as well. So please give us a quick overview of your book. I understand it's going to be a series of books. Is that correct? And also, I do currently I have purchased the first one, but I just haven't got around to listening to it yet. I've got the audio version. So just give us a bit overview of the series.
Sure. Well, gosh, now it's been, 16 years ago. I stopped trying to persuade my colleagues to write an operational history of the Petersburg campaign. None of them wanted to do it. So I said, well, I guess I'll do it. So I started this in 2005. And I'm projecting 3 volumes. There will be 3 volumes. The University of North Carolina Press is the publisher. The first volume that you have on your screen there, A Campaign of Giants, came out in 2018, and it covers the campaign from its inception through the Battle of the Crater. And the second volume, which I'm just about finished doing all the research on, I should start writing right about the first of the year, is going to carry the story from August through the very important presidential election of November of 1864. Then the third volume will complete through the winter of 1864 and 65 and all the spring offensives and the final evacuation of Petersburg on April the 3rd, 1865. It's a huge undertaking, Darren. I have to say, my bibliography.
Yeah, I can imagine. I don't envy you.
Well, it's just a big story, and
yeah, it is.
It's a lot big.
And it's nice that somebody's giving it the light of day. You know, that's the nice thing.
It's 9.5 months, more than 200,000 soldiers, and 78 battles. So there's a lot to wrap your arm.
So, what kind of research do you have to do to put something like this together? Obviously, you've got the knowledge anyway from many years of doing what you've done, but do you have access to records and bits and bobs like that?
Well, I've gone to, I think any historian who's trying to do something fresh and new and do something reasonably thorough has got to spend a lot of time in archives. And I've visited about, I guess 75 or 80 different archives throughout the country, everywhere from Maine to California. Soldiers were, as you know, Darren, and most of your listeners know, American Civil War soldiers were very literate men, and they wrote lots of letters, and letters survive, and they provide insights that published sources don't provide. So doing research for Petersburg is like doing research for any operational history. You want to consult as many manuscripts as you possibly can to get fresh insights and fresh voices and tell familiar stories in new ways, I think. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do with this series.
And that's why I really like the American Civil War. Again, like you just said it, is so many things written about it, which you can tap into, and you can actually be there as a soldier, if you really go into it. Okay, so I'd like to ask about American Battlefield Trust, because I understand you were one of the founding directors. So big thank you, because obviously if it wasn't for people like yourself, then people like me and other Civil War buffs and anybody else wouldn't be walking some of these battlefields. So just talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I appreciate that. I was certainly just one of 7 gentlemen back in 1987 who got together in my living room, actually, in response to a call made by a Park Service historian named Don Fons and a wonderful historian named Brian Pohanka, who were concerned about the fact that there's no organization, no private organization trying to raise money to save Civil War battlefields. The catalyst was a small battlefield in Northern Virginia called Chantilly. A couple of up there were concerned about Chantilly being destroyed by the construction of some condominiums. And so, long story short, we got together, not really knowing what we were going to do, but we thought we would try to form an organization that would be a membership organization that would raise money with the intent of purchasing land from willing sellers that had significance in the Civil War. And we formed something called the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which did a very good job for about a decade. We saved lots of land. And then there was another organization called the Civil War Trust that was a quasi-government organization. The two organizations merged to form what was then called the Civil War Preservation Trust, then the Civil War Trust. And now, because it includes land associated with the Revolutionary War, the American Battlefield Trust. It's an enormously successful organization.
Yes.
Not only in preserving land, but in the last 7 or 8 years, it's done a wonderful job of interpreting the property that they have preserved by providing signs and trails and in some cases even buildings that allow access to the sites. I guess one of my credos, Darren, is that preservation is a means to an end.
Yeah.
The end is getting people onto the ground and explaining to them why that ground is significant. A preserved land that you can't visit is in theory, but really doesn't do any good.
And one thing I found is if you don't actually visit the ground, you can't really actually understand what went on there. You know, that's the thing. That's the way I look at it.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. Just ask any soldier, read any soldier's account, and a wrinkle in the ground, a small hill, a stream makes all the difference in the world. You really can't understand the crater. How can guys get that close without being shot until you visit the ground and you see how the ground lies?
Yeah, and how it
elevates. Exactly right.
Yeah. So also your involvement in Pamplin Historical Park. Are you still volunteering down there, or you?
Actually, no, I retired 4 years ago. This is a real success story. It kind of grew out of a battlefield preservation effort. And I'll make a long story short, about 100 acres of significant ground at Petersburg, including some wonderfully preserved Confederate earthworks, came on the market. We did a little research and discovered that the wartime owners of that land happened to be big philanthropists whose family lived on that property during the Civil War. So we contacted them asking for a donation. Instead of a donation, they decided they wanted to buy the land themselves and build a park on it. So we built a small park there, about $5 million worth, opened in 1994. And then the Pamplin family, after whom the park is named, decided they really wanted to up the ante. They wanted to build what they called a world-class Civil War museum on the site. They insisted that I come on board to be their director. So after much deliberation, my wife and I decided we'd move to Petersburg and take this project on. Pamplin family contributed $42 million to build, which has 4 museums, 4 historic buildings, 3 general's headquarters, 3 miles of trails. It's just a spectacular place to visit. It's thriving, doing very well right now. And I encourage all of your visitors and listeners and viewers to, if they're ever in that area of South Central Virginia, to make time to visit Pamplin Historical Park.
I'm on my way.
Wonderful.
And again, Petersburg is your home now. And what I really liked about the American Battlefield Trust video as well is you took the guys around some of the, and showed them some of the old buildings. I really enjoyed that part of the video. So yeah, that's why I've got the picture in Petersburg there. That was really enjoyable because I like things like that.
I'm glad you like that. I want to clarify that when I retired, we retired to Tennessee. So I'm actually talking to you from Walden, Tennessee.
Oh, okay.
Up in the Cumberland Mountains. But I get back to Petersburg as often as I can. So
okay, yeah. Cool. Okay, well, it's been an absolute pleasure. You've been an absolute star. And thank you for all of the hard work that you've done, so we can enjoy the Civil War sites and I'm looking forward to listening to your book. So,
well, thank you, Darren. And let me compliment you too for what you're doing. And to state the obvious, if it wasn't for people like you and your viewers who are interested in this history, people like me would be irrelevant. So thank you for your interest in keeping them of these fellows alive.
Okay, cheers. Thanks a lot, mate. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.